Let's pray. God, we are grateful for your word and the truth that we can find in it. May you bless the reading of your word. May you bless the preaching of your word here in these next few moments. Whatever distractions we may have, may we put those to the side and we focus on the truth that you would have us to hear. Lord, I pray for any truth that is spoken, may it be remembered, may it be reflected upon, and may it be applied to our lives to be more like your Son. And Lord, for any misspeaking that may occur, I pray, Lord, that you would wipe that from our memory. May we focus on what is good, what is true, and what will make us more like your Son. And we pray all this in your Son's holy and precious name. Amen. So you can see we are going to be continuing our series through the book of Daniel. And last week we read the first 7 or so verses in that book. And if you did not hear, or if you were not here, then you're going to be at a bit of a disadvantage today, because almost everything that we're going to say is building upon what we talked about last week. And so I hope you were here. I hope you took halfway decent notes, and I hope you are aware of what we read and discussed last week, which, by the way, if you are here and you haven't done that, we have this great thing called the internet. And if you go on the internet, you'll find a playlist of all of the teachings that we have here. If you like to watch it live, most of the time, if our technology works, you can see it just like it is here on YouTube or on Facebook. At the very least, though, it's always recorded via audio, and you can go back and you can listen to it on Spotify or another platform or two, and all that can be found on our website. So let's be real for a second. The only reason that you don't have the knowledge that we had last week is because you refused to take it. And that's okay. Let's just call it what it is, though. And so, as I said, you'll be at a disadvantage because the outline is very similar to what we saw last week and is predicated on the knowledge of last week. It's funny. That's how the Bible works. It works on the knowledge of an entire book. They're divided up into books that tell a grand story through the whole thing. So you kind of have to know what's going on before and after it to know what's going on in the text that you're reading. And so we're picking up today in verse 8. Last week we looked at, though, the idea that God is working even in exile. We pick up the story, and the Babylonians have come into Judah, and they've taken some captives and sent Judah into exile. We saw a couple different points about God working in exile in our lives and in the life of Daniel and his friends. The first way that we saw that God is working even in exile is by being sovereign. God is a sovereign God, and there is no other God outside of the sovereign God of the universe. And we see God being sovereign in a couple different ways. One of those ways is we see God being sovereign and the fact of using other nations throughout history to building them up to this moment. The history of what is happening before Daniel chapter 1 is important to understand what's going on in Daniel chapter 1. We see that this Egyptian nation overthrew Judah and placed Jehoiakim as king. We read about that in 2 Chronicles. Jehoiakim was not even supposed to be king to begin with, yet he found himself there because of the Egyptian nation. The only reason that Jehoiakim was king, though, was because when Egypt overthrew Judah, they put Jehoiakim as king and said, hey, you can be king, but you got to pay us taxes and heavy tributes, more so than you ever have before. And Jehoiakim said, yes, we'll do that. And so they paid heavy tributes and taxes to Egypt for a very long time, or for a while at least. Nebuchadnezzar hears about this, though, and he sees an opportunity, and so he rises up and brings up the Babylonian army. He starts with Egypt, and he wipes out Egypt and shows them who's who and says, you know what, we're stronger than you are. And I'm sure Jehoiakim is all excited now because these tributes and taxes that he's had to pay are now gone. The nation's no longer there. There's no reason to pay the taxes. And so what little does Jehoiakim know is after Nebuchadnezzar is done with Egypt, he's going to walk right into the doors of Judah and take Jehoiakim down and all of the people of Judah. And that's exactly what he does. In Daniel chapter 1, we see this. And so armies aren't raised overnight. We see God using pagan nations such as Babylon and Egypt to accomplish his will and purpose. And he uses pagan people still to this day. But not only do we see it in the history, God's sovereignty, but we see it in verse 2, where it says that the Lord handed Jehoiakim over to Nebuchadnezzar. It wasn't God that just caused them to go into exile. It wasn't just God that caused Judah to fall. It was God who initiated it. God was in every step of the way, from Nebuchadnezzar to Egypt to Jehoiakim to the people to Daniel. God was involved. And it wasn't Nebuchadnezzar's God that won that day. It wasn't Nebuchadnezzar that won that day. It wasn't the Babylonian Empire that won that day. No, it was God. God was the one that won that day, because it says that he handed over Jehoiakim of Judah to the king of Babylon. And so we see that God is sovereign. Doesn't make sense. Why would God do that? We can ask all sorts of questions about that. But the point is that God is sovereign, and he does what is good, and he does what he wants to do. So we see that he's sovereign. The second thing that we see here is that he equips people. We saw that last week. And at the end of at the end of verse 7, we see these men are mentioned: Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. These men that Judah, or these men from Judah that Nebuchadnezzar and this chief eunuch or this chief official brought back. You see, they thought, well, we'll take these men with us. Because if we take these noble men, if we take these men that are of importance in Judah, well, and we bring them with us, then they'll have God won't work over there. And we'll move them to a different location because God's blessed Israel and he's blessed Judah. He must be landlocked in this geographical fashion. So if we move them over here, then these people won't matter. And just to make sure, we'll change their names to honor Babylonian gods instead of the one true and living God. So they did all those things, but what the chief official and what Nebuchadnezzar failed to realize is God isn't locked into a certain parcel of land. He isn't locked into people. He isn't locked into names. He isn't locked into stuff. He isn't locked into anything. God does what he wants, and he equips the people that he wants when he wants to equip them. And this is what he'll do with Daniel, and this is what we'll see that he does with other people as we pick up the story today. So it's important that we understand that God is sovereign and that God equips people. So the idea God is equipping people, why is God equipping people? We're going to explore that a little bit further here in verses 8 through 14. Why is God equipping people? He equips people to bring glory to himself. We see this in verses 8 through 14. Daniel determined that he would not defile himself with the king's food or with the wine he drank. He asked permission from the chief eunuch not to defile himself. God had granted Daniel kindness and compassion from the chief eunuch. Yet he said to Daniel, I fear my lord the king, who assigned your food and drink. What if he sees your faces looking thinner than the other young men your age? You would endanger my life for the king? So Daniel said to the guard whom the chief eunuch had assigned to Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, please test your servants for 10 days. Let us be given vegetables to eat and water to drink. Then examine our appearance and the appearance of the young men who are eating the king's food, and deal with your servants based on what you see. He agreed with them about this and tested them for 10 days. There's a lot of people in this story that we're going to unpack here. Last week, Daniel was faced with the decision. He had to decide, am I going to eat the king's food or not? Am I going to drink the king's wine or not? And we see the result of Daniel's decision here in verse 8. In my translation, it says that Daniel determined. Daniel chose. Daniel resolved to eat or not to partake of the king's food and the king's wine. We see his resolve here in verse 8. He said that he was not going to eat it, and he gives us a very good reason as to why. He says, I'm not going to eat the food because he didn't want to defile himself with the king's food. You know the Jewish customs, or at least you're familiar that they are there. There's several ways that if he would have ate of the Babylonian food, that these customs and these traditions and these decrees by God would have been broken. First of all, most commonly, they were only to eat certain foods, and undoubtedly the Babylonians did not follow the same dietary restrictions that the Jews and people of Judah often would. So chances are the food that would be placed in front of them, while it would be delicious food for you and I, the Jews would never eat because it breaks their dietary code. Secondly, it says that a lot of times this food and wine that was prepared, when it was prepared, it was oftentimes offered up to the Babylonian gods as a way of blessing that food, as if the food had some sort of supernatural ability now. And so they would offer it up to the gods. And God's law also states that when that food is offered up to another god, don't eat that food. We read about that in the book of Numbers. Furthermore, God says to the Jews, don't eat food that is prepared to you by Gentile hands. And the Babylonians were most definitely Gentiles. So this is like the trifecta of reasons why Daniel should not be eating this food. Prepared the wrong way, given up to the gods, and probably the wrong food that would break his code. And so Daniel says, we're not going to eat the food. I'm not going to eat the food. I resolved not to do that. But notice what he does and how he goes about doing that. He didn't pick it. He didn't start a riot. He didn't march. He didn't do anything. What does it say he did? He asked permission from the chief eunuch, or some of your translations might say chief official, not to defile himself. He's going about fulfilling God's way in the right way. He's asking permission. Hey, this is what I would like to do instead. I don't want to defile myself. I don't want to abandon my customs. I don't want to abandon the things that God has called me to do. And we see the response of the guard here. God had granted Daniel kindness and compassion from the chief official or the chief eunuch. So we see that this guard apparently wants to help Daniel, but he's a coward. Because even though he has kindness and compassion for Daniel and the things that he's experienced and everything that he's gone through here, he's still afraid because I fear my Lord the king. Because if we get to this point and I feed you this food and you don't look like the rest of them, the king will have my head, and we can't have that because I like my life. And so even though that Daniel had this kindness and this compassion, or that the eunuch had this kindness and compassion towards Daniel, he wasn't going to help him in this way. He wasn't going to grant the request. But notice something that I think we often overlook here. While the chief official of the eunuch wasn't going to grant Daniel's request, notice what happens in verse 11. So Daniel said to the guard whom the chief eunuch had assigned. How did Daniel get the guard that he now has? Who gave him the guard? That eunuch, the same person that just said, no, I can't do that. Now, I like to theorize that the chief official knew this guard very well, and that he knew that this guard liked to live on the edge, that this guard liked to push the boundaries a little bit. He liked to see them move. And so he gave him this specific guard because he knew that he would say yes to Daniel's request. And so Daniel goes up to the guard and says, hey, listen, this is what I would like to do. And while the chief official said no, after some convincing and saying, hey, we'll just try it, we'll go about this way. The guard said, yes, we will try what you ask. Like Daniel, you and I have to resolve to be committed to what we say that we're going to do. We have to be committed to following God and what he has called us to do. Last week I encouraged us all that were here during the invitation to discover, to seek, to ask, what is it that God wants us to do? Where it is that God is leading you to go? My question to you is, did you stop at verse 5 or did you continue on to verse 8? Are you determined to do whatever it is that God has called you to do? Are you determined to stay on this new path that God has called you on? How many of you determine what it is that God wants you to do, but you've fallen off and you're uncommitted to what God wants? Maybe you felt like God was leading you to give up a certain sin. Are you committed to giving up that sin? Are you committed to forgoing the pleasures of this life in order to pursue a holy God that has a holy purpose for you? Have you decided that God is wanting you to share the gospel with that person? Have you come out of your comfort zone yet and said, hey, listen, I know this is uncomfortable, but I want to have a conversation with you. Are you committed to following whatever it is that God is leading you to do? Did you decide that I'm going to be more active in the church? Are you resolved to do that? Are you determined to be more active in the church? What it is that God is leading you to do, and are you committed to doing it? Because he's saying here, when Daniel was determined, all of a sudden he equipped Daniel and his friends in order to accomplish his will and purpose. God is looking for people who are committed and determined with what's going on. I think what we have today in this church and Christian culture is we have a lot less Daniels and Mishaels and Azariah and Hananiahs, the ones that are committed to God. And we have a lot more chief officials and eunuchs, and we have a lot more guards that we see in this story. People that are being used by God, people that are being equipped by God for his glory and his honor, but yet won't ever recognize it and won't ever admit it. You know, we like to think that we're Daniel in this story, where we would give God the glory, where we would give God the credit. When we're sitting down writing our life story, we sing up like we would like to think that we're those people, but in reality, we're not. Who are we? We are the chief official. We are the guard that is being used by God, and we don't even see it. It is important that you and I take time, which is why we did this last week. We took time to see how God is moving, how God is equipping you, how God is leading you in your life, because when God leads you to something, he will equip you to accomplish that task. The more we recognize God working in the past, the more we will recognize him working in the present, and the more willing we will be to go into the future with our Lord and Savior wherever he may lead and wherever he would need to equip us. See, God is working in exile because he's equipping people to glorify himself. That's your purpose and my purpose. He glorified himself in this situation because you know the end of the story. You know what happens. He glorified himself through the chief official. He glorified himself through the guard, through Daniel, through all these other people in this story. He equipped them all, not because of their special ability, but because he wanted glory. And he can equip you that same way. Secondly, we saw last week that God is sovereign. Well, how is God sovereign? We see a couple different ways here. The first one is by changing people. By changing people. Again, I'm not so sure in the moment that Daniel and his friends saw God moving and working through people. In fact, I'm pretty sure they didn't. But when he's reflecting on these events and writing them down, he sees God moving. He sees God working in very specific ways. The first one that we saw last week was that God handed over King Jehoiakim. Another one that we see that we read today is that God granted Daniel kindness and compassion from this chief official. God granted kindness to Daniel through this person. It would be one thing to say that God just showed Daniel kindness because Daniel was a good dude. Daniel was a good dude. But that's not what God did. He showed Daniel kindness, but he showed Daniel kindness through a specific way, through this chief official and through this guard. God granted Daniel kindness and compassion from the chief eunuch. And this is the same dude, probably the guard too. This is the same person that was in Judah, that ripped Daniel from his home, ripped Daniel from his life, ripped Daniel from his culture, and tried to rip Daniel from his beliefs. It's the same guy. It's the same guy that more than likely murdered their families, or at least murdered people that Daniel was familiar with. It's the same guy that took artifacts out of God's temple and placed it in his God's temple, saying that Yahweh is dead, Jehovah is no more. This is the same guy who did all these horrible things to all of these Jewish brothers and sisters. This is the same guy. And we see that he now has kindness and compassion towards Daniel. How does that work? By God being sovereign. Be honest with yourself. This is where the rubber meets the road. Are there certain people in your life that you've given up on? Are there certain people in your life that you're saying will never change? You think that these people will always be such and such way? These people will always be trouble causers. These people will always be a gossiper. These people will always, this person will always be that way. This person will never come to Jesus. That person will never come back to Westfield. This person, that person, fill in the blank with that person. And we think that that person will never, ever change. And I know, because it happened to me. As soon as I said that, a name popped into your mind, just as it did mine. We have those people that we think will always be the way that they are. And here's the truth. I've read Scripture, and I've seen God do incredible things. I have seen God move mountains, and I have seen God change people in the Scriptures. We see people like the woman at the well that Jesus interacted with, who had 7 husbands, lived a life of adultery, wasn't really sure what the future held. She walked away telling other people about Jesus Christ. How incredible is that? God changed that woman's heart. We see people like Paul, probably most notably, a Christian murderer and killer for his entire life. Then after a dramatic event, became one of the greatest Christian missionaries, if not the greatest Christian missionary in the history of the world. God changed Paul's life. We see people in more recent history, people like Constantine, who was an emperor of Rome, did incredibly bad things to Christians, and yet all of a sudden, after a conversion experience, stopped persecuting Christians. We see people like C.S. Lewis, who was born and raised in the church, abandoned the church in his teen years and up into his 20s, and then when he was about age 31 or 32, after claiming to be an atheist for over 20 years, experienced new birth. People change, not because they change, but because God changes their heart. You see, there's no one too far gone for God. God is a miracle worker. He is the one that can change people's lives and hearts for the future. So while we may give up on people, God does not do that. So whoever that person is in your mind, I would encourage you to commit that person to prayer, because God can change their heart and God can change their life, just like he did with this official and this guard here in this story. The second thing that we see here by God being sovereign is he was acting supernaturally. Daniel decided, I'm not going to eat the food. And we see, and he's not going to drink the wine. And we did this because he didn't want to defile himself. He was doing it in obedience to what God had called him to do. And he went about it in the right way, seeking permission from the official and all these things. And through the way and through the path that Daniel took, God eventually granted that request. But here's the part that doesn't make any sense. And I'm not a dietitian, and I don't understand exactly what's going on here. But I know, because I can read and I understand a little bit of what's going on here, what Daniel was proposing made no sense to the Babylonians. Why he would forego the king's food and the king's wine to eat vegetables and drink water made no sense to the Babylonians. And let's be honest, it doesn't make a lot of sense to us. How in the world is this going to make Daniel and his friends better physically at the end of 10 days, at the end of this test? How are they going to be more advanced than the rest of the people there that are eating high protein stuff and drinking wine and doing all, like, that doesn't compute with us. Now, I'm not suggesting that you should go home and eat a bunch of vegetables. I'm not saying that you should swear off vegetables. Again, I'm not a dietitian. The point of this passage is not what to eat and what not to eat. The point of this passage is about obedience to God and how he will bless that. God is working the obedience of his people. It made no sense to the Babylonians how this diet would work. And in fact, they really thought that it wouldn't work because they only gave them 10 days. Again, I don't know how much change can occur in 10 days as far as physical appearance is concerned, unless it is a supernatural change. Yet in verse 15, what do we see? At the end of 10 days, they looked better and healthier than all of the young men. God clearly was working through a supernatural way through Daniel and his friends because they looked better than all of the king's men that ate the king's food and drank the king's wine. And not only is God acting supernaturally through their physical appearance and their physical strength through what they ate, but mentally, what do we see? In verse 17, who gave these 4 young men knowledge and understanding? God did. God gave these 4 men knowledge and understanding in every kind of literature and wisdom. And it goes on to say that Daniel got a special gift, able to understand visions and dreams as they were occurring. All of these things came not from Daniel and his friends. All of these things came from God and are supernatural things. And so we see God working supernaturally through Daniel and his friends here in this passage. Not because Daniel and his friends were special, but because God they served was special. I'd wager a guess here today that God probably works more supernaturally than we give him credit for. You and I are rational beings that like to think about things in a rational way. If there's a logical explanation for it, that's the explanation that we want, right? First of all, God's not above working through logical and rational explanations. He can do that. But what if he wants to work in a supernatural way? Like, what if we can't explain that? See, because again, I see the scriptures, and I see that the same God that I worship and serve today is the same God that created the world out of nothing. I worship and I serve the same God that sent Egyptians plagues that were supernatural, could only come from God. I serve the same God that when his people were between a rock and a hard place, he parted the Red Sea. They could have logically tried to swim across. They could have done a bunch of different things. But instead, they decided to trust in the supernatural act of God to split the sea into 2. I see a God and serve a God that can make planets stand still, like in the book of Joshua. We serve the same God who can heal people that never walked since the day that they were born, are now able to get up and run. We serve the same God who can raise people from the dead. Same God that did all of those things, the same God that did all of these things in the pages of Scripture, is the same God that you and I serve today. Why have we limited the supernatural power of God so much in our churches? And we've reduced God to having to work in rational, logical ways. Why have we stopped praying audaciously in crazy prayers that only God himself could accomplish? That's the purpose of prayer to begin with. Why have we stopped praying that God would move mountains and change lives? I would like to make a small caveat, though. All of this is predicated on verse 8, where Daniel determined to do the right thing. It was his obedience that led him to these prayers. It was his obedience that led to all this supernatural things. Am I saying that when you obey God, all these supernatural things will start happening to you? That's not exactly what I'm saying. But what I am saying is that's exactly what happened to Daniel. When he determined to follow God and what God would have him to do, all of these supernatural things, this supernatural stuff started to happen to him. Their natural physical development, their mental development, and their spiritual development and drastically improved because of the obedience that they had. Maybe the reason that we don't pray audacious prayers, big prayers, mountain-moving prayers, is because we think that we aren't worthy of having them granted to begin with. Maybe we determine not to follow God and instead follow something else. And truth be told, you're probably right. We don't deserve to have those big supernatural prayers granted. We don't. We're sinners that have strayed so far from God. And yet, we know at the same time that God is a good God. Because the most supernatural thing that goes against every fiber of our being is the gospel message of Jesus Christ. The fact that God would willingly give up his only son for people like you and me that are going to reject him daily is a supernatural work. No chance I'm doing that with my son. But that's exactly what God did with his. Knowing all the while that people would reject him, persecute him, run away from him. The gospel message is the most supernatural work that God has ever done. And so God could never do another supernatural miracle again in our lifetime and into the end of the world. And the greatest supernatural thing has already occurred in the person and the work of Jesus Christ. So I'm going to invite Addie to come up. And if you're here today and you need to experience that supernatural, life-changing miracle, today is that day. I'll be down front. I'd love to have that conversation with you. Maybe some of you have already experienced that supernatural miracle, and you've already experienced that life change. And if that's you, and that's you here today, maybe you're guilty of limiting God, saying God can only work in rational and logical ways. And you need to repent of that sin. If that's you, the altar is open for you to seek reconciliation with God in the way that he's working. Perhaps you need to come down front because you have a supernatural request of God that is just so outlandish and so crazy. It makes no sense. But yet we serve a big enough God that can accommodate whatever request that you have of him. And so whatever it is, whether you want to experience the first supernatural miracle of a new birth because of the work of Jesus Christ, whether you need to repent for limiting God in the past, for not working and not seeing how he can work supernaturally, or whether you have a big request of God, the altar is open for you to come to him with whatever it is that you might have.